All right. Hello, everyone. Hope you can hear me okay down the room. Great. Thank you for coming today to our event here at the Pioneer Institute. My name is Andrew Horgan. I'm the Chief Development Officer here at Pioneer, and we're thrilled to have a fantastic panel with us today to provide some great insights on what's really happening now in Massachusetts and what the future looks like. So it's my distinct pleasure to introduce my colleague, Connaughton, who's our Chief Operating Officer and Director of Transparency Initiatives here at Pioneer, who will be moderating today's session. And we look forward to having a conversation with all of you. And again, thanks for joining us today. So, Mary?
Thank you so much, Andrew. It's great to be here, and thank you all again for coming. Today will be a panel discussion initially, and then we'll turn it over to the audience for questions. I'd like to introduce Eileen McAnneny. She comes to us as a former president of the Mass Taxpayers Foundation, and she's currently our Senior Economic Policy Fellow. Also with us is Aidan Enright. He's our Economic Research Associate, and he's also our Fellow on Immigrant Entrepreneurship. So we're pleased to be here, and we will get started now. All right, to start out with Eileen. Eileen, Fiscal Note, a DC-based software firm that tracks legislation across the country, recently found our state legislature as the least efficient in the nation. In 2023, of the 21,500 bills introduced, only 21 were passed. What is going on in Massachusetts at the legislature? What's the dynamic between the branches of government, particularly in the Senate and the House? Can you give us some insights, please?
Sure. Good afternoon, everyone. So I would say in a phrase, the dynamic between the two branches is not good. There's always tension, it seems, but it feels like it's much more so than usual. And I point to at the end of the formal sessions in July, the Senate President and the Speaker were trading barbs like in the media. And I think, you know, they're doing less. And part of that is because they're not collaborating and working on, you know, consensus. I also think the fact that the dynamic in the legislature more generally has changed. All the power is concentrated in the Speaker and the Senate President's office. And so it's a small funnel and less gets done. And I think that you know, that carries on to some of the committee chairs. The kind of silver lining in all of this is the chairs of the Ways and Means Committee do seem to work together and collaborate. And that may be because they're both in line to be the next leader of their respective branch. There is a lot of talk and chatter about the Speaker and the Senate President stepping down, although I will say that's been going on for a little while now. So eventually it'll be true. But what it means is getting anything over the finish line will be a challenge with that dynamic. And to the inefficiency, I mean, I think that just speaks to Massachusetts has a full-time legislature. It's one of about 10 states that do, and yet they're the least productive. So I don't know, like that speaks volumes. I don't want to say.
And do you want to talk about question one and anything that's going on and what's happening there?
Well, yeah, I would say question one was the ballot initiative that gave the auditor the ability to audit the legislature. The legislature pushed back kind of vigorously against that, and they cited to separation of powers issues. But the public voted, I think, 70 to 30%. It got the third highest voter approval, I think, of any ballot initiative in Massachusetts. And I think it speaks to the frustration of people with the opacity with, you know, in which the legislature operates.
And rest assured, Pioneer's keeping a really close eye on what's going on there. TBD. Okay, another question for you, Eileen. Yeah. State revenues over the past couple of years have been dodgy a bit. I'm sorry. Can you hear that? Okay, thank you. State revenues over the past couple of years have been dodgy, to say the least. There were some times last year where revenues fell below projections. They fell below the prior year's actual numbers. You know, at one point, Beacon Hill was awash in funds. We got so much money from the federal government for COVID relief. They were flying high, I would say. What do you think the fiscal outlook is for state revenues regarding FY26?
I think they're uncertain. And as Mary said, I think COVID changed a lot of things. I think it upended state finances to some extent. We got a huge influx of federal money, the ARPA money it's called, and that has to be spent by the end of this year. The legislature spent it on a lot of things, and they'll have to now try to fill the void. Some of it was one-time spending, investing in capital and so forth, but some of it was for operational spending, which means they're going to have to find a new source of revenue to backfill when the federal funds dry up. And I would say what's interesting, speaking to the inefficiency of the legislature, right now there are 3 fiscal years that the Ways and Means Committee are dealing with. One was fiscal year 2024. It ended June 30th. But the legislature just last week passed a closeout budget so that the comptroller can close the books on the Commonwealth. It was over $700 million. And there was a net cost to the state of about $136 million. And the state paid for that by taking money that would have gone into the stabilization fund. But we haven't closed out fiscal year 24, despite the fact that they were statutorily required to do so by October, and it's December, and the comptroller is just getting those figures. And then we're about 6 months into the current fiscal year, and revenues have been somewhat volatile. In November, revenues came in above projections or expectations, but for the year, we're still below that benchmark or the estimated amount. And the Department of Revenue testified recently that they think the money will come in about 2% below what they had originally projected. So to be determined what happens with the current fiscal year. And then fiscal year 2026, which begins July 1st, kicked off with a consensus revenue hearing. And that's the first step where experts testify and they project what the state will have for the next fiscal year. It's difficult because you're looking 18 months out, and it's a best guess. But they also were very cautious, saying that revenues would probably grow between like 1.9 and 3.1%, which isn't very high. It's a little less than typical. But the other issue, that's one side of the ledger. The other problem is the spending pressures grow, right? We all know about the emergency assistance pressure. That was $1 billion last year. The governor has indicated there's just not enough money to continue it, but there will be some pressures with respect to that. And we don't know what else is coming down the pike. There could be federal changes that impact a lot of the federal revenue we receive. So, like in a nutshell, I think there'll be less money. There may be more demand on programs. There'll probably be more scrutiny of them. And we'll have to just wait and see how it all turns out.
To your knowledge, have any of the bond rating agencies spoken up or commented on any of this yet?
I have not heard that there has been any kind of downgrading at this point.
A potential one. Okay.
Yeah.
All right. So, Aidan's done quite a bit of work looking at net out migration of the state, people leaving, more people leaving than coming in, more taxpayers leaving than coming in. This has to catch up with us sooner or later. Can you share with the audience who's leaving and what's going on with migration out of the state and how that might impact our fiscal outlook?
Yeah, so I would start with a little bit of context there. Massachusetts has been losing people to a certain extent for a long time, and there's been ebbs and flows. The migration we've seen in the last couple of years, particularly from 2020 to 2022, has been a tremendous uptick, something that we haven't seen before. From 1993 to 2019, we lost about $24 billion in adjusted gross income from people leaving the state. In just the 3 years from 2020 to 2022, we lost almost $11 billion. So there's been a significant uptick. That amounted to about 71,000 net taxpayers leaving the state. What's really kind of alarming is who those people are that are leaving. We have a lot of young people, particularly those from the ages of 26 to 34. A lot of them educated professionals already making over $100,000, as well as wealthier people with incomes greater than $200,000. There's been an uptick.
So what are the demographic trends that are also contributing to this? I mean, we want to keep our population. Our population is really important for the overall success of the state. But are there other demographic trends that are factoring in that kind of exacerbate this issue?
Yeah, I think especially when speaking about the younger people leaving, we already have an aging workforce. We have a lot more people 65 years and older in the labor force than we did several years ago. If we continue to lose a lot of young professionals, that's going to have an effect, especially when businesses are deciding where they want to locate. If the labor force is not growing, if it's becoming older here, they may not see it as a location that they want to start in. They might go somewhere else that's growing. I think that's important. And to go back to the last question that I missed is when we have all of these people leaving the state and we're losing that AGI, that also detracts from tax revenue. So if we have $11 billion leaving the state, that's about $500 million less in tax revenue that's being brought in that the state can invest in certain critical areas.
I read a stat recently about birth rates in Massachusetts and how they compare to the rest of the nation. Does that factor in as well?
That certainly factors in. We have a very low birth rate compared to a lot of other states, and we have a very small younger age population. We have the 5th smallest 18 and younger population as a percentage of the total amount of people in the state. If you look at the age demographics of 5 to 14, we have the smallest percentage of those people out of the total population of the state anywhere in the country. And so we already have a very strained pipeline of young people. And so if we're not bringing people into the state and we're losing a lot of young professionals, it's going to probably decrease the number of people in the workforce over time.
Which hurts our competitiveness and our economic future.
And you know what, I would just add one thing: when the people of workforce age leave, you don't just forfeit their revenue for that year. It's obviously for their working life. So that's a huge problem long term.
Yeah. There's a negative annuity there.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah.
All right. Eileen, we all remember the surtax passing in 2022, much to our chagrin. An additional 4% on incomes over $1 million. And we surmise that that's a major reason for people leaving the state. We know we'll know more specifically when the IRS releases its 2023 data on migration, because 2023 was the first year it went into effect. Proponents of the surtax say this has been wildly successful. Is that true? Do you think it's a trend that's going to stay? And what are your thoughts on the surtax going forward?
So I think the proponents declaring victory on the income surtax is a lot like when George Bush put up the mission accomplished for the Gulf War. Turns out it was very premature, right? And I think their declaration of victory is very premature for a few reasons. As Mary said, we don't even have the full year, the first year's full collection data. People often extend, the tax return date to October 15th. And so DOR hasn't even finally tabulated what those revenues are. So again, we have less than a full year to base that declaration of victory on. The other thing is they cite that the revenues came in at a much higher rate than predicted, but that also is not actually true in the sense they're mixing up what the legislature budgeted of that money, right? So the legislature included about $1 billion of the income surtax in the budget, but it was always estimated that it would generate about $2 billion. And the thing to remember is the income surtax was around for about a decade before it actually got approved. And DOR did an initial revenue estimate that had the money at about $2 billion. So a decade later, when the stock market has done really well, and most of the money comes from interest, dividends, and capital gains, the fact that we're coming in around $2 billion, to me, says it's not as successful as folks are indicating. The other thing I would point to, and it's anecdotal, but the Mass Society of CPAs, they survey their members, and I forget what the numbers are, but something like 90% of the CPAs that completed the survey said they have at least one client who's moved, others who are thinking about it. And I think it takes time for people to react to the income surtax and to migrate. So I think we haven't seen the impacts of it, certainly to the full extent that we will, and we won't probably until probably several years from now.
Okay. And the money is supposed to be going to education and transportation. Have you been able to track to see, is that really happening? How would we actually even go about that with the fungibility of cash?
So the legislature did try to make good on the fact that the money has to go to education and transportation. They set up a separate trust fund and all of the money has to go in there. And again, in the first year, they were able to do that. I think what will be interesting is other tax revenue sources like corporate excise and estate tax and some of the other miscellaneous taxes have seen a decline. And so what it means is the income surtax will make up a greater portion of overall revenues that the Commonwealth receives. But if they have to be earmarked for education and transportation, it leaves less money for everything else, right? And so how it all plays out, it will be interesting over the next few years.
Certainly will. Aidan, so if the surtax is driving people out of the state, well, to back up, like in 2020, Andrew McCullough, our housing senior fellow, did a paper called The Big Lure. Now, this was pre-surtax, but it showed all the states and all the incentives they're trying to give people to move to their state. And I noticed recently there's a lot of ads like from New Jersey trying to lure people and businesses to New Jersey from Massachusetts. So the surtax gives other states a good opportunity to market themselves. Where are people in Massachusetts going? And what are these states doing to lure them now?
Sure, that's a great question. I just want to tack on one thing to what Eileen said before. There have been kind of some estimates of what income tax revenue have been minus the surtax, and they're down by about $850 million. And so even if we're getting more money from the surtax, if we're losing money from regular income taxes, that affects the broad fiscal picture. As far as what states are doing that Massachusetts maybe is not, in order to lure people out of the state, you have to look at affordability. It's a very difficult decision for someone to make to move out of state. And so there has to be significant cost pressure for them to do so. If you look at a state like New Hampshire, who a number of Massachusetts residents are going to, about 1/4 of all the residents of New Hampshire are original Massachusetts natives. That's how many people have left for that state. They don't have a lot of the taxes that we do. They don't have an estate tax. They don't tax capital gains. They are eliminating their tax on interest and dividends. Housing is a lot cheaper. That's a pressure point for a lot of young people. You can buy a house in New Hampshire for about 20% less than you can in Massachusetts, and probably get more land and space when you do it. So if you're looking to start a family, that's something that you're going to be taking into account. If you look at the greater Boston area, the median price of a single family home right now is going for about $850,000 just to rent. a 2-bedroom apartment is about $3,200 a month. Those are significant cost pressures for people. And so they're looking to move to states that are affordable, where their money's going to go further, where they can buy a home and start a family, or where they're not being taxed as much.
That's true. I mean, even with the high rents, you can never put enough money away to save. Even if you can afford the rentals, you can't save money to buy a house. It's a huge issue. I just wanted to add that also New Hampshire doesn't have that income tax as well,
Right.
on top of the taxes that you listed. Okay, Eileen, there's a lot of talk about the need to improve the state's competitiveness. Given the trends that Aidan discussed, we know that we have some big, pretty strong headwinds, facing us. What is the legislature doing to try to mitigate some of this?
Sure. So as you said, there's a lot of talk. And for any of you who have heard the governor speak or Lieutenant Governor Driscoll, they always mention the need to improve competitiveness, affordability, and equity. I call it their tagline of the administration. So I guess the good news is there is acknowledgement that we need to do something. The legislature would point probably to 3 things that they've done. One is the tax reform bill. It passed last year. It was $1 billion in tax relief, and it provided a variety of increases and credits and so forth. So, but discrete or subsets of taxpayers. So they increased the rental deduction. They increased the senior property tax circuit breaker. They increased the child care credit. So for folks who qualify, that probably helps, I would say, only at the margins, because if you're getting a $600 child care tax credit, but child care costs $25,000 a year, like it's not making that much of a difference. But they would point to some of those things for affordability. On the competitiveness standpoint, they did 2 things. They reduced the tax rate on short-term capital gains from 12 to 8.5%. And then on the estate tax, they increased the income threshold from 1 million to 2 million. The problem is that didn't go far enough in my estimation, because it's not enough to make a difference. Massachusetts is one of only about 12 states now that have an estate tax at all, and we're still on the lower end of the exemption. Short-term capital gains, we're one of like 2 or 3 states that tax short-term capital gains differently than earned income or regular income. So I don't know that it moved the needle in the way that the legislature hoped. They also did an economic development bill. It just passed. They did it very late. They had to come in for a special session. And the thing is, the title of it is called Lengthen the Lead. And the idea is Massachusetts has some industries where we do well and that we're leading the nation. And so they doubled down on them and put some money. And the 4 industries are biotech, clean energy, advanced manufacturing, and healthcare. I think there are some headwinds potentially for all of those sectors. And the problem is they're picking winners and losers. And whether they get it right or not, time will tell. But what they didn't do is provide any kind of cost relief for the thousands of other businesses that aren't in one of those 4 sectors. So I'm not sure that moved the needle either. And then they did a housing bond bill with the notion that if we want to keep people here, we have to make housing more affordable, as we've heard. And it was the biggest housing bond bill in the state's history, and they're very proud of that. The issue, though, as all of you know, a bond bill authorizes spending, but there are bond caps that the state operates within. So that whole $5 billion isn't going out onto the street in any one year. It'll probably be about $500 million. And it may make a difference, but it'll take several years to do so. So, I'm not sure if we're going to move the needle. There's some more immediate things that they could do, like more tax relief or maybe healthcare cost relief, but we'll see if that's forthcoming.
If you had your druthers, Eileen, what would you have them do that could significantly move that needle?
Well, I think they have to do something more immediate that signals, we want to be competitive. We want you to stay here. We appreciate your
locating here, whether you're a business or an individual. And to me, the fastest kind of relief you can provide would probably be tax relief, because it can go into effect immediately and people see it. I do think healthcare costs, they're not really the focus of this discussion, but Massachusetts has a healthcare affordability crisis, and they could do something to help relieve that cost, because that was one of the 3 primary drivers of people to leave Massachusetts.
Do you think the legislature has a real good understanding of the threats that it faces? Or do you think they're living in a different place?
I think yes and no. And I think yes, because the data is kind of overwhelming, right? So unless they're burying their head in the sand, I think they have to like understand that it's a new day after COVID and with remote work and the like. But on the other hand, Massachusetts prides itself on having what I say an eds and meds economy, right? So healthcare, a huge sector of the economy, so is higher education. And I think there's a lot of thought on Beacon Hill that they'll always be our calling card, and that they're recession proof, and that, you know, that will always be the bedrock of our economy. And I just think there are signs that that may not always be the case either.
Okay, thank you very much. Now, you mentioned remote work. I know Aidan has done a bit of work on remote work. What do you see the current trends are for remote work? We've read in the paper that some industries are having people going back, 4 days, 5 days, larger companies, maybe some in the like accounting firms, things like that. Do you see the trends changing? And do you think that Massachusetts is disproportionately affected by remote work compared to other states with net out migration?
Yeah, first I would start with the fact that there's been a significant amount of research that come out recently tying remote work to migration. I think that's something that's kind of intuitive. About 50% of the uptick in migration in the last couple of years has been a direct result of remote work. Massachusetts has a lot of industries, the financial sector, a lot of the software engineering and tech jobs that are particularly lend themselves to remote work. We have one of the largest remote workforces in the country, and we're losing a significant number of those workers. About 40,000 left between 21 and 2023. There was a Brookings study that found that of all major metro areas, the greater Boston area lost the 3rd most amount of digital service workers from 2020 to 2022. This is something significant, and it probably is encapsulated by who is leaving. A lot of these younger workers are the ones who are filling these positions, highly educated workers that make significant income, and so losing them is going to be an issue. Massachusetts, a lot of remote work, the biggest remote work trend is that there has been kind of a rollback. There are fewer fully remote workers than there were just a couple of years ago, but Massachusetts has lost those workers disproportionately. While the number has decreased nationally by about 7%, the number in Massachusetts has decreased by about 17 or 18%. So we're seeing a significant decline there.
So we were talking about the cost of living and remote work, and one of the main reasons for younger folks leaving is housing issues. We've recently passed, or the state recently passed, the MBTA Communities Act a couple of years ago, as well as streamlining the permitting process for accessory dwelling units 900 square feet or less. I'm asking Eileen if she thinks that those measures will be enough to start to combat this, and what that means for the overall economy of the state.
I mean, I think it's a start. I don't know that it will be adequate. And I do think, why we're focused on housing and the need to improve the cost of housing is because Massachusetts' economic calling card for so long has been our talented workforce. We have a lot of very smart people here, and it fuels our innovative economy. And when you have signs that the highly educated
high earners of workforce age are leaving. What's the problem is then we may not have the concentration of talented workers that fuel the innovation economy. And so, and I think that there is absolutely a focus on housing, certainly to house people because it's a basic human necessity, and that should be the focus. I think the focus on its importance from an economic standpoint, I think we need to continue to emphasize because it's very much interrelated.
Very much so. Okay, Aidan, putting on your immigrant entrepreneur hat, what has the effect been of immigration in mitigating the impact of net out-migration? What are the trends and what are the demographics of immigrants today in Massachusetts versus 20, 30, 40 years ago?
Well, Massachusetts has for a long time filled in labor force gaps and kind of mitigated out-migration from the state with immigrants. About 70% of the gains we've made in the labor force in the last decade are from immigrants coming into the state. We're not really, like I said before, we have a lot of very, very few young people in the state, and so we're not really growing in that way. The difference now is that the number of immigrants has risen significantly, and kind of the composition of those immigrants has changed as well. They're more educated than previous cycles of immigrants into the state, but still less educated than the native-born population of Massachusetts. You have a lot more migrants and other low-skilled people coming, and that obviously changes the composition of the workforce. If you're losing very highly skilled, educated workers and replacing them with lower skilled migrants that can't necessarily fill the same types of jobs, that can be a detriment for the state long-term.
Okay, and if we didn't have the immigrants coming in as we do, where would our state be in terms of population loss? Would it be population loss?
Yeah, I think it'd be pretty significant population loss. We're bringing in something around the lines of 50 to 60,000 immigrants every year. And so if for whatever reason that pipeline diminished, the domestic out-migration that we're seeing would be a lot worse. We'd probably lose tens of thousands of people every year, and I would imagine that would accelerate.
Thank you. With respect to workforce, having a highly skilled workforce is key to keep employers and attract employers to the state. Aidan published a paper last spring showing that the labor force of 24 to 54-year-old men is decreasing, going down. Eileen, what does that mean? What do we have to do for the workforce to try to make sure that the skills that our workforce has is consistent with the jobs that are available or will be available in the future?
I mean, so I think there are probably three issues we have to focus on with respect to the workforce. One, the pace of change, right? With AI and technological advances, people need to keep up their skills and hone skills, right? And learn new skills. And that's people who are currently working. And then you have baby boomers retiring in record numbers, and without immigrants, we can't backfill them. But the issue is the profile of immigrants has changed. You know, we used to have highly educated, and not to say we still don't, but fewer. Many more of the immigrants don't speak English, are lower skilled. And so we need to upskill and give them the training that they need so that they can be part of the workforce, right? And then the other issue is we have a growing number of people, certainly I think young men and some older men among them, who are sitting it out altogether, right? Like they're not part of the workforce. Our labor force participation rate is higher than the national average, but it's about 66%. I mean, that means a third of people who should be working are not, right? And so I think we have to figure out how we get some of those people on the sidelines into the workforce. And it maybe we have to look at, you know, some of the safety net programs, or, you know, just provide them more training to the jobs of tomorrow. I mean, I think there's a lot of things we have to focus on, but the answer to the workforce is going to take several strategies.
Is there anything in specific programs that they are doing, the state's doing, that actually works, that is really improving the workforce, or specific sectors in the workforce that you can think of?
I don't want to be facetious, but we're spending more money probably than we ever have on workforce training, and some of it has been federal funds, some of it is the recognition of the challenges that I talked about. But our unemployment numbers are creeping up, so I'm not sure that it's having the result that it should. And part of the reason not sure is because reports are not readily available to the public about how successful these programs are at job placement and keeping people employed and so forth, or even graduation or completion of the program. And so I do think that's an area where Pioneer has focused and will continue to focus, because we all recognize the need for a skilled workforce, and the state is investing heavily, but I don't know if we're getting the outcomes we need. And part of it is the money is now much more diffuse. So it used to be, it would be in the Executive Office of Labor and Workforce Development. Now every secretary gets money for workforce training. And I don't know that there's anyone who's keeping tabs on all of it and kind of overseeing it and managing. So I think there's a lot of opportunity in that regard.
What would you recommend? Is there a way to kind of bring it all under one roof that would work?
Yeah, I mean, I think there should be more accountability for the money spent. There should be more public reporting. There should be, in my mind, someone who oversees all of the workforce training dollars. So a czar of workforce training, if you will. And then there's probably a need to integrate workforce training with some social services, or, you know, there are people who maybe they don't have transportation to get to where they need to go, and with a little help they might be able to get there. So I think recognizing there are a lot of people on the sidelines, recognizing that a lot of the immigrants that are coming are of low income. If we want to get them in the workforce and be productive, we have to think about what are the services that the state can provide that will help do that.
Thank you. Aidan, you've done on your work with immigrant entrepreneurs. I know you've cited some stats that are pretty amazing in terms of the success of immigrant entrepreneurs in this state. If you'd like to share some of those, please do. But based upon your research, what can the state do to make sure that immigrant entrepreneurs can achieve their full potential within our economy and hence grow our economy?
Yeah, so just to give people a primer, immigrants, low skilled or high skilled, are about 2 times as likely as native born US residents to start their own business. I just want to piggyback off Eileen a little bit in her talking about workforce development. One easy way that we can kind of support the immigrant population and better integrate them into Massachusetts is through our second language learning acquisition for adult programs. They're called ESOL. Right now, they're kind of disparate. They're not very coordinated. And most often they're not tied to vocational training. We have 2 great programs that do, but we have few others. So most of the time, immigrants are going to these programs and they're just learning English, but they should also be connecting them and training them for the jobs that are available and where we need to place them in the workforce. That also could include resources for entrepreneurs in starting a business, in growing it, in marketing and other things like that. I also see kind of these issues around licensure as a huge barrier to immigrants. They may not be as accustomed to how things are done here, how to start a business, the actual process of it. If you look at Boston, for example, if you want to start a barbershop, It takes like something around the lines of 90 to 100 steps. You're working with several different departments. There's no one central location where you're completing paperwork. And so just kind of consolidating those things and having an easy portal that immigrants can go to, or just any kind of entrepreneur can go to in order to register their business and license it. You also have a lot of occupations that are licensed in the state that can provide a barrier, particularly like cosmetology and anything to do with manicurists. A lot of those programs have certain requirements, certain education requirements for a high school education or a bachelor's degree that make it difficult and less accessible for immigrants.
Is there anything on the horizon to kind of streamline the visa process for immigrants, particularly those graduating from our universities with advanced degrees?
I think there's some interest in that at the federal level. There's been talk of a entrepreneurship specific visa for a long time. We have a lot of international students that come here and they gain specialized knowledge in particular fields, and they're also very easily integratable because they speak English very highly. But there is no specific visa pathway for very highly skilled immigrants who are interested in starting businesses. And so there has been different bills that have gone before Congress to try to create a pathway. I think that might be something that is still of interest for the future.
Terrific.
So I would just add two things. In the economic development bill, there was a provision that made it easier for physicians trained in other jurisdictions to be able to practice here, given kind of a shortage, particularly of primary care physicians. So that's one. And then there was in the economic development bill, it was called the Mass Residency Program, but it's an acknowledgement of the fact that we need to make it easier for visas. And so there's a program to address that, but it's not scaled to the extent it needs to be.
I would also add one point that immigrants, besides for young people, are the largest population of underemployed individuals in the state, about 15% of immigrants. A lot of times they come with credentials and with education, but they don't, those credentials aren't acknowledged or accepted by the state. Even if they're an immigrant who's moving in from another state, we don't have reciprocity with licensure. And so a lot of those people are not in the kind of more educated and professional occupations that they could be if the state made gains in those areas.
In those are areas where employers need employees. Right?
Exactly.
All right. Well, that concludes our panel discussion. We'd like to open it up for questions on any of these topics.
I'm happy to ask one. So, Eileen, your experience, I think you're the perfect person to direct this question to with your experience at Mass Tax. I'm curious about how dependent Massachusetts is on federal dollars in general. And given the change in administration, what kind of potential risk is there in terms of the Massachusetts budget for fiscal 2026, for example? And maybe if you can break down a little bit of where those key areas are, because when you look at the budget overall, I know a lot goes to Medicaid, but there's a lot that go other places that people may not be aware of.
Sure. So I think Massachusetts faces some risk, right? With the new administration, we have an all Democratic congressional delegation, and so they are not the party in power, and so won't have the ability to bring home the bacon, if you will, in the way that they would have if they were in the majority. I think probably the biggest risk is Medicaid, the program, because it's the biggest single budget item in Massachusetts, and on a gross basis, it's about 40% of the budget, net about 20 or so, give or take a few percentage points. And so Massachusetts has one of the most expansive Medicaid programs in the country. And, you know, I don't know if there'll be those dollars available. We operate under a waiver. And so in some ways, like, it's set for a number of years, but it doesn't mean that there couldn't be other pressures or just, you know, other ways in which they could cut funding. So I think we'd have to worry about that. I mean, transportation is another big area where we get federal funds. And I mean, I haven't heard the Trump administration really focused on transportation the way they are on some other issues. But I do think, you know, as we've discussed at length today, immigration is important in Massachusetts because our native-born population can't fill the current jobs. And so it depends on how immigrants are targeted and what the net impact of that. If we lose some so that our job vacancies go unfilled, that has economic consequences. I mean, I think those are the big federal issues I see, but federal funds are sprinkled. You know, workforce training is another area where we get a lot of federal funds. So, I mean, I think, yeah, in general, given the notion that they want to cut a lot of the government inefficiencies, you know, some of these programs could be a target for sure.
Other questions? Yes.
Can I ask a question? I'm on the Zoom.
Yeah, we have someone in the audience asking a question, then we'll get right to you.
Okay.
Yep.
Here, try this.
Yes, thank you very much. I already heard you recognize the election, even though it's still about to be born for the Trump administration. Are you familiar with the new department that's being proposed, the DOGE department? And do you see any of that initiative at the state level during Governor Healey's administration?
So I haven't heard talk of that, and there's no formal commission or state agency, but I think a challenging budget forces that to some extent, right? If you have money that can't cover all of your current programs, then they revisit some of the spending issues and they pare down things. And so that may happen out of fiscal necessity.
Thanks. A question from Zoom?
Yeah, it's Stephen Mead. You hear me okay?
Oh, great.
Good. Going back to the budget from an expense standpoint, as you look out to 2026, 27, what are the key sort of big pressure points in terms of, as you look at the expense increase? I can't imagine the expenses are going to go down. I can imagine the expenses are going to go up a lot faster than the resources, but certain line items, let's take education, let's take healthcare, let's take benefits in terms of retirement benefits. What are the key pressure points on the budget and some of the rates of growth that you're looking at for those line items?
I think all of the issues you mentioned are an issue. And I would say in the past couple of years, there have been a few new initiatives that will take resources. One has been making community college free for everyone. And you know, that I'm not disputing whether it's a good thing or a bad thing, but it will add cost to the system. And so that's one area. The other is during COVID, there was a lack of daycare or, you know, providers for young kids. And so the state expanded subsidies they give to daycare providers and to some families. And they were able to do that with federal money initially, but now that's an expense that'll be borne by the state. So they're going to have to come up with a funding source for that. I think we all know that just energy costs, healthcare costs, labor costs are tending to rise. And so the state, as you know, is the largest employer, faces some of those kind of bread and butter challenges that every business faces. I think there's an unfunded, if we want to get our transportation system in a state of good repair, or, you know, take care of the maintenance backlog, you're looking at $25 billion plus. We are paying down the pension obligation, you know, but that will take some time too. I think, I don't have the number off, or the year off the top of my head. I think it's 2030. They want to have the pension obligation fully funded, but it's somewhere in the near future. I mean, those are just some for starters. And then I would say the emergency assistance, right? That was an unforeseen expense. If something like COVID happens, like, you know, we're talking about the finances for the world we know, but there's always something that comes up, right? So we don't know on a global level what could happen and the implications for state finances. So, I mean, there's a lot of play.
Bob, did you have a question? Bob?
Oh, I did.
Yeah.
Yes, this is a much less significant question. My daughter works at Lowell Technical Schools, very important component of our workforce training. And there's a huge rise in demand for entry into those technical schools, far more than they can manage at the moment. And a lot of children of immigrant families are going this route as well. Is the fix just more money for more technical schools, or what?
I mean, I'm not an education expert, but I will say this. I think there are a few things at play. And one is, as the cost of going to college gets more out of reach for a growing number of people, a very good alternative is technical schools in the trades, right? And there's a shortage of trades people. And so I think it's natural that there's a growing demand for them because you can make a very good living. I mean, I think we should consider either redirecting some of the money for workforce training on other programs to technical schools, because they tend to have known outcomes and you know, are pretty successful. So that's one option. I mean, it may be directing, again, there's all this money from the income surtax, which has to go to education and transportation. To me, that would be a good use of some of the education dollars, because there is that demand. And the important thing to know, Jamie Gass, my colleague, would explain this better, but is after ed reform, technical schools have to give you both an education so you're able to pass standardized tests, plus the technical or vocational experience. So you're getting a twofer essentially, right? And so that's why I think a lot of people are interested in going there, and we should recognize that and have sufficient supply to meet that demand, in my estimation.
Yeah, my daughter has worked at several different public schools, and finally she's at Lowell Tech, and she says it's mind-blowing what goes on there. It's so good.
Yes.
Just wondering if the unemployment problem, that big bill that we're due the feds, is coming to roost, and how that's going to be dealt with.
So that was one I should have mentioned when someone talked about, you know, unforeseen or expenses. What the gentleman is referring to is during COVID, Massachusetts, every state got a lot of federal money for unemployment and got benefits out quickly. That was the goal, just because as the economy shut down. But Massachusetts utilized federal funds inappropriately for a state program to the tune of about $2 billion. And so, you know, if we have to pay that back, typically the Unemployment Insurance Trust Fund is funded by a surcharge on employers' unemployment insurance bills. And so that could be another potential new tax, right? That in order to cover that, they might increase the rate for employers. I'm pretty sure the employer community will say, no, that wasn't our fault, that wasn't our mistake, take the money out of the stabilization fund, but I don't know what will happen there.
All right, I think that's all the questions we have time for. I want to turn this over back to Andrew Horgan.
Great. Well, thank you, Mary, Aidan, Eileen, for really a fascinating conversation today. And thank you all for joining us. These conversations wouldn't be happening or possible or make a real impact without you coming and participating and asking these important questions. So I just want to express our gratitude for that. We'll have a full slate of events coming up in the new year. So if you have not already subscribed to our newsletters or any of our other information, we encourage you to do so. You can access some of the research that's happening here on the back sheet that's in front of you. And of course, as we head to the end of the calendar and tax year, I would not be doing my full job without asking and thanking all of you for your consideration in supporting our work. The incredible research that the team here is doing and the rest of Pioneer is doing to have these conversations truly is not possible without that support. So thank you for your consideration for that. Thanks for coming today. Hope you'll stick around and ask any other questions you have, and hope you have a wonderful holiday and new year. Thank you, everyone.